Officer Jack rudely arrested 9-year-old Selena, accusing her of stealing without even trying to listen. But he never imagined what would happen next. What happened didn't just turn his life upside down. It became his biggest nightmare. What was it that hit him so hard? Watch on to find out. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss stories like this, and write in the comments, when was the last time you saw such blatant lawlessness? The sun shone brightly over the bustling street as Salyana sat patiently on a wooden bench near the entrance of a local grocery store. She was a 9-year-old black girl with bright, curious eyes and a small, gentle smile. Her favorite toy, a plush teddy bear with slightly worn ears, rested snugly in her lap. Today was a good day, and Salyana felt a sense of excitement as she waited for her mother, Tasha, who had gone inside to do some quick shopping. The air was filled with the sounds of children laughing, the distant rumble of cars, and the faint chatter of passers-by. Salyana loved to observe people as they walked by, families with children, older couples holding hands, teenagers sharing jokes. She kicked her feet back and forth under the bench, humming a soft tune and letting her imagination wander. She thought of her school friends, the games they played at recess, and the stories they told each other. She was also thinking about the promise her mother had made. They would have her favorite dessert tonight if she behaved herself. Her eyes sparkled as she imagined the taste of strawberry shortcake. People came and went from the store, some carrying bags of groceries, others talking on their phones. Occasionally, someone would smile at Salyana, and she would shyly smile back, hugging her teddy a little tighter. Her mother had always taught her to be polite and respectful, and she prided herself on being well-behaved. She was a good girl, and she knew it. The neighborhood was familiar to her, a place where she felt safe. The grocery store was a spot she and her mother often visited, and the people here were mostly friendly. She had never imagined that anything bad could happen in such a comfortable and familiar setting. She glanced towards the entrance, hoping to catch a glimpse of her mother, but Tasha was still inside, lost in the maze of aisles and shelves. Unbeknownst to Salyana, Officer Jack had been patrolling the area in his cruiser. Jack was a tall, stern-looking man in his late 30s with short-cropped hair and a muscular build. His face bore the marks of years on the force, the hard lines etched into his skin by stress and an unwavering dedication to his duty. He prided himself on his vigilance, a trait that had earned him a reputation among his colleagues as someone who always had an eye for trouble. Jack believed in keeping the streets safe, and for him, that meant being suspicious of anyone who looked like they didn't belong. As Jack drove past the grocery store, he noticed Salyana sitting alone on the bench. A young child, unattended, looking around nervously. His instincts were triggered immediately. He slowed his cruiser, narrowing his eyes as he observed her from across the street. In his mind, children didn't usually sit alone outside stores without reason. He had seen it before. Kids used as lookouts or distractions for petty theft. It all seemed too familiar, and Jack wasn't one to take chances. He parked his cruiser on the opposite side of the street, his gaze fixed on Salyana. She seemed too calm, too settled, and his suspicions only grew as he watched her. Jack's upbringing had taught him to always be wary, to always assume the worst and act accordingly. He believed that was what made him a good cop. And now, here was this little girl, all by herself, clutching a teddy bear and glancing around. Was she waiting for someone? Was she part of something larger? Jack's thoughts raced as he got out of his cruiser. He adjusted his belt, his hand instinctively resting near his radio, and started walking towards the entrance of the store, his eyes never leaving the girl. His polished black shoes clicked against the pavement as he approached her, his face set in a firm expression. He had seen too much in his career to ignore what might be trouble, no matter how innocent it seemed. Salyana noticed the shadow that loomed over her, and she looked up, her eyes widening slightly as she saw the police officer standing in front of her. She had always been taught that police officers were there to help, that they were the good guys, but something about the stern expression on Officer Jack's face made her feel uneasy. She clutched her teddy bear tighter, her small fingers digging into the worn fabric. "Hey there, young lady," Jack said, his voice deep and commanding. "What are you doing here all by yourself?" Salyana swallowed, her voice barely a whisper as she answered, "I'm waiting for my mommy. She's inside shopping." She tried to smile, hoping it would make the officer less intimidating, but her lips trembled and the smile faded quickly. Jack frowned, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the grocery bags people were carrying out of the store. He glanced back at Salyana, noticing the teddy bear and the small backpack at her feet. "How long have you been sitting here?" he asked, his tone sharp. Salyana blinked, her mind racing. She didn't know how to answer. She hadn't really been keeping track of time. Not too long, sir. My mommy said she'd be quick," she replied, her voice shaky. Jack's suspicion only deepened. He had seen this kind of nervousness before. To him, it was the nervousness of someone hiding something. He crossed his arms over his chest, towering over the little girl. "Are you sure you're not waiting for someone else? Maybe trying to keep an eye out?" Salyana's eyes widened, and she shook her head vigorously. "No, sir. I'm just waiting for my mommy," she insisted, her voice cracking as fear began to set in. She didn't understand why the officer was being so harsh. She hadn't done anything wrong. Jack wasn't convinced. He looked around, scanning the area as if expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. He leaned down slightly, his face closer to Salyana's. "Listen, young lady, you need to tell me the truth. Did you take something from the store? Are you in some kind of trouble?" Tears welled up in Salyana's eyes. She shook her head again, her voice barely audible as she whispered, "No, sir. I promise. I didn't do anything." Jack straightened up, his expression hardening. He had seen enough. To him, the signs were clear. She was lying, and he needed to take control of the situation before it escalated. He reached down and took hold of Salyana's arm, his grip firm. "All right, that's enough. You're coming with me," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Salyana gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. "No, please. I didn't do anything wrong. My mommy's inside," she cried, her voice breaking as tears streamed down her cheeks. But Jack wasn't listening. He was too focused on what he believed was the right thing to do, ensuring the safety of the community by taking action. As Jack began to lead Salyana away from the bench, her cries grew louder, attracting the attention of people passing by. Several shoppers stopped in their tracks, their eyes widening in shock as they saw the police officer pulling a crying child towards his cruiser. Murmurs of confusion and concern rippled through the crowd, and some people took out their phones, recording the scene unfolding before them. Inside the store, Tasha was just finishing up her shopping. She had managed to get everything on her list and was looking forward to getting home and spending the rest of the day with her daughter. As she approached the checkout line, she glanced at her watch, realizing she had taken longer than she'd intended. A pang of guilt tugged at her. She hoped Salyana wasn't too bored waiting for her. After paying for her groceries, Tasha made her way towards the exit, balancing several bags in her hands. As she stepped outside, the first thing she noticed was the crowd gathered near the entrance. People were whispering, some pointing, others holding up their phones. Tasha's heart skipped a beat, a sense of dread washing over her. She pushed her way through the crowd, her eyes widening in horror as she saw what was happening. There, just a few feet away, was Salyana, her sweet, innocent little girl, with tears streaming down her face, her small body shaking as a police officer held her arm firmly. The officer was dragging her towards a patrol car, his expression cold and unyielding. "Salyana!" Tasha screamed, dropping her bags without a second thought. She rushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "What are you doing? That's my daughter!" Jack turned his head, his expression one of annoyance as he saw the woman running towards them. "Ma'am, step back," he ordered, his voice stern. "This girl is suspected of shoplifting. I need you to stay back while I handle this." Tasha's eyes blazed with a mix of fear and fury. "Shoplifting? Are you out of your mind? She's 9 years old. She was just waiting for me." She reached out, trying to take Salyana's hand, but Jack stepped between them, blocking her path. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down," Jack said, his voice growing more authoritative. "If you don't step back, I'll have to take further action." Tasha's hands trembled, her heart aching as she looked at her daughter's tear-streaked face. "Please, she didn't do anything," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Just let her go. We can sort this out without scaring her like this." But Jack was unmoved. In his mind, he was following protocol, doing what needed to be done to maintain order. He tightened his grip on Salyana's arm, preparing to lead her the rest of the way to the cruiser. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, the tension in the air thickening as more people gathered to watch the scene unfold. Tasha felt a surge of desperation. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let her daughter be taken away like this, not when she had done nothing wrong. She took a deep breath, her voice trembling but determined as she spoke. "I want to speak to your supervisor. Right now. You can't just take my daughter without cause." Jack hesitated, his jaw clenching as he looked at the crowd, then back at Tasha. The situation was quickly spiraling out of control, and he could feel the eyes of the onlookers on him, their judgment palpable. He knew he had to make a decision, one that would either defuse the situation or escalate it even further. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. Was he really doing the right thing? Was this little girl truly a threat, or had he let his own biases cloud his judgment? The tension hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, as Jack faced the mother and daughter before him, the eyes of the community watching his every move. The tension that hung in the air seemed almost unbearable, like a thick fog wrapping around everyone standing in front of the grocery store. Tasha's heart raced as she tried to meet Officer Jack's eyes, her fury barely restrained. Her daughter, Salyana, stood beside him, her small face streaked with tears, her teddy bear now dangling from her hand, almost forgotten. Jack's grip on her arm remained firm, his body language rigid and unyielding. The onlookers continued to gather, murmurs growing louder with each second that passed. "I'm not asking any more," Tasha said, her voice trembling with both fear and determination. "I'm demanding to speak to your supervisor. You cannot treat my daughter like this. She's done nothing wrong." Jack's jaw clenched as he looked back at the crowd, noting the increasing hostility. His training had always taught him to control a situation quickly before things got out of hand. But this time it seemed like the more he tried to control, the worse it was getting. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, judging, questioning. It made his skin prickle uncomfortably. He looked down at Salyena, who was shaking, her eyes wide with terror, her small voice sniffling out soft sobs. Jack took a deep breath, his face hardened by years of experience in a field that required him to see threats everywhere. He had spent so much of his career working off instinct, reading people, and making snap judgments. And in that moment, he was still holding on to his belief that this little girl, alone in front of the grocery store, must have been up to something. He had seen it all before. Kids used as lookouts, kids carrying stolen goods, kids who were taught how to lie and distract. He refused to let himself be fooled. Not again. "Ma'am, please understand," Jack began, trying to keep his voice steady, though the tension in his tone was unmistakable. "This child was acting suspiciously. It's my job to ensure that nothing illegal is happening. I have every right to take her in for questioning if I believe there's reasonable cause." Tasha felt her hands shaking as she stepped forward, her body now between her daughter and the officer. "My daughter is 9 years old. She wasn't doing anything. She was waiting for me, like I told her to. You can't just take her away. Look around you. There are cameras in the store, people who saw everything. She didn't steal anything. She didn't do anything wrong." Jack frowned, glancing back towards the store, noticing a few people nodding in agreement with Tasha. The crowd was becoming restless, and a few individuals stepped closer, their phones still recording. He caught snippets of their whispers. "That poor child. She's just a kid. Why is he being so aggressive?" Jack tried to ignore the whispers, but they were getting louder. He knew this was getting out of hand, and if he didn't do something, it could escalate even further. He wasn't used to this. People questioning his authority, doubting his judgment. He had always been the one to take control, to make decisions that others were too scared to make. A man in the crowd suddenly stepped forward, his voice loud and clear. "I saw the girl sitting here the whole time, officer. She didn't do anything suspicious. Maybe you should just let her go." His tone was calm but firm, and his words seemed to resonate with the onlookers, who nodded and murmured in agreement. Jack's grip on Salyena's arm slackened slightly, and he glanced at Tasha, who stared at him with fire in her eyes, tears still welling up. He could feel the weight of their collective judgment pressing down on him, and for a split second, doubt flickered through his mind. Had he misread the situation? Was it possible that he had been too quick to judge? Suddenly, the store manager appeared, pushing his way through the crowd. He was a balding man in his 50s, his apron covered in flour from the bakery section. He looked around, his eyes wide with confusion and concern as he saw the scene before him. "What's going on here?" the manager demanded, looking between Jack, Tasha, and the crying little girl. Tasha turned towards the manager, her voice filled with desperation. "Please, sir, tell him. My daughter didn't steal anything. She's been waiting for me right here. There are cameras, right? Can you please check them and tell him she's innocent?" The manager nodded, glancing at Jack, who was still gripping Salyena's arm. "There are cameras," he confirmed, his tone cautious. "If there's any question about what happened, we can review the footage." Jack hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the manager. He didn't like being second-guessed, especially not in front of a growing crowd. He had a reputation to uphold. He was the officer who kept this neighborhood safe, who didn't let anything slide. But as he looked down at Salyena's tearful face and then back at Tasha's pleading eyes, something inside him softened, just a little. "Fine," Jack said at last, releasing his grip on Salyena. The little girl stumbled back into her mother's arms, and Tasha held her tightly, whispering reassurances into her ear. Jack could feel the eyes of the crowd on him. still watching, still recording. He took a step back, his expression guarded. Let's go inside and review the footage. If it shows that she didn't do anything, then I'll let her go. Tasha nodded, holding her daughter close as she followed the manager towards the entrance of the store. The crowd parted to let them through, their murmurs softening as they watched the family move inside. Jack walked behind them, his face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He was supposed to be in control, not questioned, not doubted by the very people he was trying to protect. The manager led them to a small room at the back of the store, where the security monitors were located. The room was cramped, filled with screens showing different angles of the store and its surroundings. The manager gestured for Tasha and Jack to come closer as he began rewinding the footage from the entrance. Jack stood stiffly, his eyes fixed on the screen as the footage played. There was Salyena, sitting quietly on the bench, her teddy bear in her lap. She was looking around, watching people pass by, but there was nothing unusual about her behavior. No sign of her stealing anything. No sign of anyone else approaching her or giving her instructions. She was just a little girl, waiting for her mother, just like Tasha had said. Jack felt his chest tighten as he watched the footage. He glanced over at Tasha, who was holding Salyena tightly, her eyes red from crying. The look she gave him was one of pure anger and disbelief, and Jack found himself unable to meet her gaze for long. He turned back to the screen, swallowing hard as the reality of the situation sank in. He had made a mistake. The manager paused the footage and turned to Jack, his expression neutral, but his eyes filled with judgment. "Looks like she was just sitting there, officer. I don't see anything that suggests she was doing anything wrong." Jack nodded slowly, his face flushing with shame. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "All right," he said, his voice quieter now. "I see that. I apologize." Tasha shook her head, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Apologize? You scared my daughter half to death. You put your hands on her, treated her like a criminal. She's 9 years old. How could you do that?" Jack opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He had no excuse, no justification that would make what he had done okay. He had let his biases cloud his judgment, and now he was facing the consequences of that mistake. He looked down at Salyena, who was still clinging to her mother, her eyes wide with fear. The guilt washed over him like a tidal wave, and he found himself at a loss for what to do next. The manager cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. "Officer, I think it's best if you leave now. You've caused enough distress for this family today." Jack nodded, his face burning with shame. He turned and left the room without another word, his footsteps heavy as he made his way back through the store. The crowd outside had mostly dispersed, though a few people remained, still watching, still whispering. Jack kept his head down as he walked back to his cruiser, feeling the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. As he reached his car, Jack paused, his hand resting on the door handle. He looked back towards the store, where Tasha and Salyena were still inside, the mother comforting her daughter, trying to calm her down after the ordeal she had just been through. Jack took a deep breath, his heart heavy with regret. He had spent his whole career believing that he was protecting people, that he was making the right choices to keep his... The days that followed the incident at the grocery store were a blur for Jack. He tried to go about his duties, patrolling the streets of the neighborhood he had served for years, but nothing felt the same. His mind was haunted by the memory of Salyana's terrified face, her innocent tears, and the look in Tasha's eyes, an expression of pure, righteous fury that cut through him like a knife. No matter how hard he tried to shake it off, the weight of his actions clung to him like a shadow. The story of what happened spread through the neighborhood quickly. People talked about it in hushed whispers in cafes and on street corners. Videos taken by bystanders were shared online, gaining views and stirring outrage. The local news picked it up. A segment about a police officer wrongfully detaining a young black girl, causing a wave of anger among residents. The scrutiny Jack faced was unlike anything he had ever experienced. He had always been respected, seen as the officer who kept the streets safe. But now, people looked at him with distrust and disdain. As he walked his beat, Jack noticed the way people avoided his gaze. Mothers pulled their children closer when he passed by, and shopkeepers who once greeted him warmly now offered only curt nods. He felt the divide growing between him and the community, a divide that he had unwittingly created. He wanted to explain, to tell them that he was just doing his job, that he never meant for things to go so wrong. But deep down, he knew that his words would mean nothing against the harm he had caused. Jack's fellow officers at the precinct were divided in their reactions. Some were sympathetic, offering him words of support and telling him that he had done what he thought was right, that anyone in his position would have made the same call. But others kept their distance, their silence speaking louder than any words of condemnation. Jack could feel the tension in the air whenever he walked into the precinct, conversations that stopped abruptly, glances exchanged between colleagues. He knew that he was now a symbol, a reminder of what could go wrong when an officer acted without thinking. The chief called Jack into his office a few days after the incident. Chief Reynolds was a stern man with graying hair and a deep voice that carried authority. He looked at Jack across his cluttered desk, his eyes hard and unreadable. Jack stood at attention, his stomach churning with unease. "Jack," the chief began, his voice measured, "I've been getting calls, lots of them, from the community, from the mayor's office, from people demanding answers." He paused, his gaze never wavering. "I've reviewed the footage, read the reports, and I've got to say, this doesn't look good. You know that, right?" Jack nodded, his throat dry. "Yes, sir, I know." The chief leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "You've always been a good cop, Jack. But this was a serious lapse in judgment. You acted without evidence, without cause, and you put your hands on a child. You let your biases guide you, and now we're all dealing with the fallout." Jack swallowed hard, his eyes dropping to the floor. He had heard those words before. Bias, judgment, but hearing them from the chief made it all the more real. It was like a punch to the gut, the truth he had been avoiding staring him right in the face. "We're going to have to take action," Chief Reynolds continued, his tone firm. "Effective immediately, you're suspended without pay. There will be an internal investigation, and depending on the outcome, further disciplinary measures may follow." Jack felt the world tilt beneath him. Suspended. The word echoed in his mind, bringing with it a sense of disbelief and dread. His job was everything to him, his identity, his purpose. Without it, who was he? He wanted to argue, to plead his case, but he knew there was nothing he could say that would change what he had done. "Yes, sir," Jack said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. The chief nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Take this time to think, Jack. Reflect on what happened and why. Maybe you'll find some answers." Jack left the office in a daze, his mind numb. He walked out of the precinct, the weight of his suspension pressing down on him like a physical burden. The streets outside were bustling with people, but Jack felt disconnected, like he was moving through a world that no longer welcomed him. Meanwhile, Tasha was grappling with her own emotions. The days after the incident were filled with a mix of anger, fear, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. She had always tried to teach Salyana that the world was full of good people, that the police were there to protect them. But now, those beliefs felt shattered. How could she tell her daughter to trust the police after what had happened? How could she reassure her when she herself felt so betrayed? Salyana had been quiet since that day. She no longer smiled as easily, her laughter replaced by a cautious silence. At night, she would wake up crying, her small body trembling as she clung to her mother. "Mommy, why did he think I was bad?" she would ask, her voice filled with confusion and hurt, and Tasha had no answer, no words that could make the fear go away. Tasha knew she couldn't let this go. She had to do something, not just for Salyana, but for every child who might face the same kind of treatment. She reached out to community leaders, to activists, to anyone who would listen. She told her story, shared the footage, and soon the neighborhood was rallying around her. People organized meetings, demanding accountability from the police, demanding changes to ensure that what happened to Salyana would never happen again. The local community center became a hub of activity. Flyers were distributed, meetings were held, and people came together to discuss how to move forward. Tasha stood before a room full of people, her voice steady despite the fear she felt inside. She spoke of what had happened, of the terror in her daughter's eyes, of the way Jack had refused to listen. She spoke of the need for change, for training, for accountability. "We can't let this happen again," Tasha said, her voice ringing out with conviction. "Our children deserve to feel safe. They deserve to know that they will be treated with respect, no matter who they are or what they look like. We have to stand together and demand better." The crowd erupted in applause, their faces filled with determination. People began sharing their own stories, instances of bias, of unfair treatment, of moments when they had felt powerless in the face of authority. It was a wave of voices, a chorus of pain and resilience, and Tasha knew that they were making a difference. They were no longer silent, no longer accepting the status quo. Jack watched from afar, seeing news segments about the community's response, hearing about the meetings and the protests. He felt a sense of isolation that cut deeper than anything he had ever experienced. He had thought he was doing his job, that he was protecting the community, but now he saw that he had been wrong. He had let his own fears, his own biases guide his actions, and he had hurt the very people he was supposed to protect. One evening, Jack found himself standing outside the community center, the sounds of a meeting drifting out through the open windows. He could hear Tasha's voice, strong and unwavering, speaking of justice, of the need for change. He stayed in the shadows, his heart heavy with regret. He wanted to go inside, to apologize, to make things right, but he didn't know how. He wasn't sure if he even had the right to ask for forgiveness. As the meeting ended, people began to file out, their faces filled with a mix of hope and determination. Jack stepped back, his gaze lowering as he watched them pass. He saw Tasha among them, her arm around Salyana, the little girl's eyes still wary, still haunted. Jack's chest tightened, a lump forming in his throat. He wanted to call out to them, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he turned and walked away, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a heavy stone. He knew that he had a long way to go, that there was no easy path to redemption. But as he walked through the quiet streets, he also knew that he couldn't give up. He had to find a way to make amends, to prove that he could be better, that he could change. The conflict had only just begun, and Jack was determined to face it, no matter how painful it might be. He had spent too long hiding behind his badge, too long letting his fears dictate his actions. It was time to confront the truth, to confront himself, and to find a way to rebuild the trust he had broken. The journey ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and doubts, but Jack knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let this be the end. He had to do better, not just for himself, but for Salyana, for Tasha, and for every person in the community he had sworn to protect. And so, with a heavy heart and a newfound resolve, Jack took the first step towards change, ready to face whatever came next. Jack's suspension had left him with an overwhelming amount of time to think. The reality of his actions and the repercussions they had on Salyana and Tasha weighed heavily on him. He couldn't escape the memory of that day, the fear in Salyana's eyes, the crowd's disapproving murmurs, Tasha's desperate pleas. The more Jack thought about it, the more he realized that he needed to confront the person he had been, the biases he had carried, and the damage he had caused. The neighborhood was changing. The protests and community meetings were gaining traction. News outlets continued covering the story, and the pressure on the police department was mounting. People wanted answers, they wanted change, and they weren't going to let up until they got it. The narrative had grown beyond just what happened to Salyana. It had become a symbol of systemic injustice, of the distrust that existed between law enforcement and the communities they served. Jack's absence from the force was a topic of conversation at the precinct. Officers were on edge, worried about how the growing unrest would affect their work. Some were sympathetic to Jack, but many believed that he had crossed a line, that he had made their job even harder by feeding into the very stereotypes they were trying to move away from. Officer Mina Thompson, one of Jack's colleagues, had always believed in the importance of community engagement. She was vocal in her criticism of Jack's actions, not out of spite, but because she knew that what he had done was wrong, and it hurt the relationship between the police and the people they served. One morning, as Jack sat in his apartment, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, he received an unexpected message. It was from Mina. She had been one of the few officers who hadn't reached out to him since his suspension, and Jack had assumed that she, like many others, wanted nothing to do with him. But the message was straightforward. "We need to talk. Meet me at the community center." Jack's heart pounded as he read the message. He wasn't sure what Mina wanted, but he knew that he couldn't ignore it. He needed to face the consequences of his actions, even if that meant confronting his colleagues and the community that now saw him as the enemy. He grabbed his jacket and headed out the door, his mind racing with uncertainty. The community center was bustling when Jack arrived. People were setting up tables, organizing pamphlets, and preparing for another meeting. Jack hesitated at the entrance, his nerves getting the best of him. He could feel the stares, the whispers, the judgment that followed him wherever he went. He took a deep breath and stepped inside, scanning the room for Mina. He found her near the back, talking to a group of volunteers. When she saw him, her expression was unreadable, and she excused herself from the group, walking over to where Jack stood. She crossed her arms, her gaze steady as she looked at him. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said, her voice devoid of the usual warmth she once had for him. Jack nodded, his throat dry. I wasn't sure either, but I know I need to be here. Mina studied him for a moment before motioning for him to follow her. They walked to a quieter corner of the center, away from the bustling activity. Mina leaned against the wall, her eyes never leaving Jack's. Do you know why I asked you here? Jack shook his head. I can guess, but I'd rather hear it from you. Mina sighed, her expression softening slightly. Jack, what you did was wrong. You know that. But it's not just about you making a mistake. It's about what that mistake represents to this community. People here already have a hard time trusting us. And when someone like you, someone they thought they could trust, does something like this, it breaks whatever fragile trust we've managed to build. Jack looked down, the weight of her words pressing heavily on him. I know, Mina. I know I messed up. I've been trying to figure out how to make it right, but I don't even know where to start. Mina paused, then spoke, her voice steady. You start by listening, by understanding what you did wrong and why it hurt so many people. This community center has become a place where people come to share their experiences, to demand change. If you're serious about making amends, then you need to hear those stories. You need to understand the pain that your actions caused. Jack swallowed hard, nodding. I want to understand. I want to do better. Mina nodded, her eyes softening. Good. Then you'll stay for the meeting today. You'll listen, not as a cop, but as a member of this community. You need to understand what people are going through, what they're fighting for. Jack agreed, his heart heavy but resolute. He followed Mina to the main hall, where chairs were being arranged in a circle. He took a seat towards the back, feeling out of place but determined to stay. Slowly, people began to filter in. Residents from the neighborhood, community leaders, parents, and even a few teenagers. Jack recognized some of the faces, people he had seen while on patrol, people who now looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and distrust. Tasha arrived with Salyina, and Jack felt his chest tighten. He watched as they took a seat, Tasha's arm protectively around her daughter. Salyina's eyes scanned the room, and for a brief moment, they locked onto Jack's. Her expression was guarded, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. Jack quickly looked away, his heart aching at the thought of the pain he had caused her. The meeting began, and one by one people stood up to speak. They spoke of their experiences with law enforcement, of moments when they had felt ignored, dismissed, or even threatened. They spoke of the fear they felt for their children, of the worry that they would be judged by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. Tasha stood up, her voice steady but filled with emotion as she recounted what had happened to Salyina. She spoke of the terror her daughter had felt, of the way Jack had refused to listen, of the lasting impact it had on their family. Jack listened, his heart sinking with every word. He could feel the anger in the room, the pain, the betrayal, and he knew that he was the cause of it. He had thought he was doing his job, that he was protecting the community, but all he had done was add to their fear and mistrust. When Tasha finished speaking, there was a heavy silence in the room. Jack could feel the weight of their collective gaze, the expectation that hung in the air. He knew that he couldn't stay silent any longer. He stood up, his legs feeling shaky as he faced the room. I want to apologize, Jack began, his voice barely above a whisper. I know that what I did was wrong. I know that I hurt you, that I hurt your families, and that I broke the trust you had in me. I let my own biases get in the way of my duty to protect and serve. And I'm so sorry for that." He paused, his eyes meeting Tasha's. She looked back at him, her expression unreadable. Jack took a deep breath and continued. "I know that words aren't enough. I know that I have to show you that I can be better. I want to learn, to understand, to be the kind of officer you deserve. I'm here today because I want to start that journey. I want to earn back your trust if you'll let me." The room was silent for a moment, and Jack could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to expect. Anger, rejection, maybe even silence. But then, slowly, Tasha nodded. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. A small step towards something better. Mina spoke up, her voice calm and measured. "This is a long road, Jack. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be quick. But if you're serious about this, then we'll be here to hold you accountable, to help you learn." Jack nodded, his eyes misty with emotion. "I am serious. I want to do whatever it takes." The meeting continued, the tension in the room slowly beginning to ease. People began to speak again, this time not just about their pain, but about their hopes. Hopes for a better relationship with law enforcement, hopes for a community where they could feel safe and respected. Jack listened, his heart heavy but filled with a sense of purpose. He knew that he had a long way to go, but for the first time since the incident, he felt a glimmer of hope. As the meeting came to a close, Tasha approached Jack, Salyana at her side. Tasha looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "I'm not ready to forgive you, Jack, but I appreciate that you're trying. My daughter deserves to feel safe, and I hope that one day you can help make that happen." Jack nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I understand, and I promise you, I will do everything I can to make things right." Tasha gave him a small nod, then turned and walked away, Salyana holding her hand. Jack watched them leave, his heart aching but filled with determination. He knew that this was just the beginning, that there was still so much work to be done. But he was ready to face it, to confront his own flaws, and to become the officer and the person that his community needed. Mina placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice gentle. "You took the first step today, Jack. Just keep going." Jack looked at her, a small, hopeful smile tugging at his lips. "I will." And with that, Jack knew that his journey had truly begun. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick, but he was ready to face the challenge. For Salyana, for Tasha, and for every person in the community who deserved to feel safe and respected, Jack was determined to make a change, no matter how long it took. The following weeks felt like an uphill battle for Jack. The weight of his suspension still hung over him, and his sense of purpose felt shaken to its core. The days blurred together, filled with restless thoughts and sleepless nights, each moment a reminder of how he had failed not only Salyana and her family, but himself and the community he had sworn to protect. The news coverage had quieted down, but the damage remained, etched in the minds of those he once served. Jack spent his days attending the sensitivity training sessions that were mandated as part of his suspension. He had initially approached these sessions with a defensive mindset, his pride wounded and his heart full of resentment. But as he sat through discussions, case studies, and group exercises, something inside of him began to shift. He couldn't ignore the stories being shared, the first-hand accounts of people who had faced prejudice, the children who were taught to fear law enforcement, the mothers who had experienced the same kind of terror that Tasha had felt that day. One particular session stood out to him. The instructor, a black woman named Alicia, spoke with a calm authority that commanded the room. She shared her own experiences growing up in a neighborhood where she was constantly viewed as a suspect, where her father had been stopped countless times for simply existing in his own skin. As she spoke, her words painted a picture of fear and helplessness that resonated deeply with Jack. For the first time, he saw the other side of the uniform. The fear, the distrust, the pain that came with being on the receiving end of unchecked authority. Jack felt a pang of guilt as he thought of Salyana. He remembered her tears, the way she had looked up at him with nothing but fear in her eyes. He had been that figure of authority, the one she had been taught to trust, but who had instead terrified her. He realized that he had never truly understood the impact his actions could have on the people he interacted with. To him, it had always been about upholding the law, about doing his job. But now he understood that there was so much more to it than that. There was a responsibility to treat people with dignity, to see them as human beings rather than potential threats. The following day, Jack found himself at the community center once again. This time, he wasn't there to watch from the shadows. He had made a decision. He needed to face the community, to speak to them, to try and make amends. As he walked through the doors, he felt his heart pound in his chest, his palms sweaty with anxiety. He didn't know if they would even let him speak, let alone forgive him, but he had to try. Inside the community center, a group of people were gathered in the main hall. Jack recognized some of them: neighbors, shopkeepers, parents. At the front of the room stood Tasha, her expression strong and determined. She was in the middle of addressing the group when she noticed Jack standing in the doorway. The room fell silent, all eyes turning towards him, the atmosphere thick with tension. Jack took a deep breath, stepping forward. I know I don't deserve your time," he began, his voice shaky but sincere. "But I need to say something. I need to apologize." Tasha's eyes narrowed, her arms crossing over her chest. She didn't say anything, but she didn't stop him either. Jack took that as a sign to continue. "I made a terrible mistake that day," Jack said, his voice growing steadier as he spoke. "I let my own biases cloud my judgment, and I hurt a little girl who did nothing wrong. I hurt her family, and I hurt this community. I've spent the last few weeks trying to understand why I did what I did, and the truth is, there's no excuse. I was wrong, and I'm so sorry." The room remained silent, the tension palpable. Jack looked around, meeting the eyes of the people who had once trusted him, who had once seen him as their protector. He saw skepticism, anger, hurt, but also a flicker of something else. Curiosity, perhaps, a willingness to listen. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," Jack continued, his gaze shifting to Tasha and Salyana, who stood beside her mother, her small hand gripping Tasha's tightly. "I know that I have to earn that, and I know it won't be easy, but I want to make it right. I want to learn, to do better, to be better, and if there's any way I can help this community, I want to be a part of that." For a long moment, no one spoke. Jack's heart pounded in his ears, the silence almost unbearable. Then Tasha stepped forward, her eyes locked on Jack's. She studied him, her expression unreadable, and Jack braced himself for whatever she was about to say. "Words are just words, Officer Jack," Tasha said at last, her voice steady. "What matters is what you do from here on out. You hurt my daughter. You hurt me. And I can't just forgive that because you say you're sorry, but—" She paused, glancing down at Salyana, who looked up at her mother with wide eyes. But if you're serious about wanting to change, if you're serious about wanting to help, then maybe there's a place for you here." Jack felt a rush of emotion, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. He nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you. I promise. I won't let you down." Tasha gave a small nod, her expression softening just a fraction. "We'll see. Actions speak louder than words, officer." Jack knew she was right. This was only the beginning. There was so much work to be done, bridges to rebuild, trust to regain. But as he looked around the room at the faces of the people he had once thought he was protecting, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there. And for Jack, that was enough to keep going. Over the next few days, Jack began to volunteer at the community center. He helped wherever he could, cleaning, organizing events, assisting with the after-school programs. It was hard work, and the stares and whispers from some of the parents were a constant reminder of the trust he had broken, but Jack didn't shy away from it. He knew that this was part of his journey, that he had to face the consequences of his actions head-on if he ever wanted to make things right. Slowly, the community began to warm up to him. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't easy, but Jack could feel the shift. Children who had once avoided him started to say hello, their smiles hesitant but genuine. Parents who had glared at him with suspicion began to nod in acknowledgement. And then, one day, as Jack was helping set up tables for a community dinner, Salyana approached him. She stood a few feet away, her teddy bear clutched tightly in her arms. Jack paused, his heart pounding as he looked at her. He gave her a small smile, not wanting to scare her away. "Hey, Salyana," he said gently. "How are you?" Salyana didn't answer right away. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Then, slowly, she took a step closer. "Are you really sorry?" she asked, her voice small and unsure. Jack felt a lump form in his throat. He knelt down so that he was at eye level with her, his gaze earnest. "I am, Salyana, more than I can ever say. I never meant to hurt you, and I'm so sorry for what I did. I promise I'm trying to be better." Salyana studied him for another moment, then nodded. "Okay," she said softly, "but you have to keep trying." Jack smiled, his eyes misty. "I will. I promise." It was a small step, but it was a step nonetheless. And as Jack stood up, watching as Salyana returned to her mother, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for weeks. He knew that the road ahead was still long, that there were still challenges to face and bridges to rebuild, but for the first time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction, one step at a time, one act of kindness at a time. Jack had confronted his biases, and now it was time to prove, not just to the community, but to himself, that he could be the man he wanted to be, a man who truly protected and served, with compassion, empathy, and understanding. The community hall was filled with a sense of anticipation. Chairs were set up in neat rows, and a microphone stood at the front of the room. The space buzzed with low murmurs and the shuffling of feet as people filed in. The hall was packed with neighbors, activists, and members of the community, all here for the meeting that Tasha and the others had fought so hard to arrange. This meeting was about accountability, about ensuring that what had happened to Salyana would never happen again. Jack stood near the entrance, his palms clammy with nerves. He had arrived early, but instead of taking a seat, he found himself hovering by the door, unsure of whether he even deserved to be here. It had been weeks since he had begun volunteering at the community center, but tonight was different. Tonight, he would have to stand in front of the people he had wronged, to look them in the eye and try to make things right. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the anxiety that gnawed at his insides. Jack had spent sleepless nights thinking about this day, about what he would say. He had rehearsed his words over and over, but now that the time had come, his mind felt blank. What could he possibly say that would make up for the pain he had caused? How could he prove that he was sincere, that he wanted to change? The lights in the hall dimmed slightly, and Tasha walked up to the microphone, her presence commanding the room. She looked out at the faces in the crowd, her expression a mix of determination and emotion. She took a deep breath, her voice steady as she began to speak. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Tasha said, her gaze sweeping over the audience. "This meeting is about more than just what happened to my daughter. It's about all of us, about making sure that every child, every person in this community, is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. We are here to talk about accountability, about change, and about justice." The crowd nodded, a few people murmuring in agreement. Tasha continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke of the need for police reform, for better training, for officers to understand the communities they served. She shared the pain of that day, the fear that had gripped her when she saw her daughter being taken away. Her words were raw and honest, and Jack could see how deeply they resonated with everyone in the room. When Tasha finished speaking, there was a moment of silence, and then the room erupted in applause. Jack swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew what was coming next. He had asked for this, asked for the chance to speak, to apologize, to try and make things right. But now, as Tasha gestured for him to come forward, his legs felt like lead. Slowly, Jack made his way to the front of the room. He could feel the weight of every gaze on him, the judgment, the anger, the distrust. He stepped up to the microphone, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted it. He looked out at the crowd, at Tasha, at Salyana, at all the people he had sworn to protect, and he felt the full weight of his mistakes. "Good evening," Jack began, his voice shaky at first. He cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. "My name is Officer Jack Thompson, and I'm here tonight to apologize. Not just to Tasha and Salyana, but to all of you. I made a terrible mistake. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and I hurt an innocent child." He paused, his eyes finding Salyana in the crowd. She was sitting next to her mother, her teddy bear clutched tightly in her lap. Jack's chest tightened at the sight of her, her eyes still wary, still filled with the hurt he had caused. "Salyana," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion, "I am so sorry. You deserved better from me. You deserved to feel safe, to be treated with kindness and respect. I failed you, and I can never undo that. But I promise you, I am trying to change. I am learning, and I am doing everything I can to be better." He looked back at the crowd, his gaze meeting the eyes of the people who had come to hold him accountable. "I know that words are not enough," Jack continued. "I know that an apology can't erase what happened, but I'm here tonight because I want to be part of the solution. I want to help make the changes that this community needs. I am committed to learning, to listening, and to being the kind of officer that you all deserve." There was a moment of silence, and Jack could feel the tension in the room. He had no idea how his words would be received, whether they would make any difference at all. But he had spoken from his heart, and that was all he could do. Tasha stood up, her eyes locked on Jack. She walked towards him, her steps slow and deliberate. The room was so quiet that Jack could hear his own heartbeat, the sound of his breathing. When Tasha reached him, she looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but strong. "Thank you, Officer Thompson," she said. "Thank you for being here tonight, for apologizing and for committing to change. But this isn't just about words. It's about action. We will be watching, and we will hold you accountable." Jack nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He knew she was right. This was just the beginning. The real work was ahead of him, the work of proving, day by day, that he was worthy of the trust he had broken. Tasha turned back to the crowd, her voice rising as she addressed them. "This is how we move forward," she said. "We hold each other accountable. We demand better, and we work together to create a community where everyone feels safe, where everyone is treated with respect. This is just the beginning, but I believe we can make it happen." The crowd erupted in applause once more, and Jack felt a glimmer of hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. He stepped away from the microphone, his heart heavy but resolute. He had a long way to go, but he was ready to take the next step. As the meeting came to an end, people began to file out of the hall, their faces filled with a mix of emotions: hope, determination, caution. Jack stood by the door, watching as they left, nodding to those who met his gaze. Some people offered him small smiles, others merely looked away, but Jack understood. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. It would take time, patience, and consistent effort. Tasha and Salyana were among the last to leave. As they approached, Jack felt his heart pound in his chest. He looked down at Salyana, her eyes still wary but no longer filled with fear. Tasha paused in front of him, her expression softening slightly. "We're willing to give you a chance," Tasha said, her voice quiet, "but it's up to you to prove that you deserve it." Jack nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I will. I promise." Salyana looked up at him, her small voice breaking the silence. "Are you going to help at the center again?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. Jack felt a lump form in his throat, and he nodded. "Yes, Salyana, I'll be there, and I'll do whatever I can to help." She gave him a small, hesitant smile, and Jack felt a warmth spread through his chest. It was a start, just a start, but it was more than he could have hoped for. As Tasha and Salyana walked away, Jack stood there, watching them until they disappeared into the night. He took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling his lungs. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time Jack felt ready to walk it, one step at a time, determined to make things right. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our new videos. We tell stories that inspire and make you think. Want to see more? Click here to watch the next story, which will definitely not leave you indifferent. Where are you watching this video? Write in the comments, we'd love to know.